Hi, this is Alex Bryan, President of East West Associates. I want to thank you all for joining our webinar today, specifically about transferring technology. The title of it is Relocating Out of China, Critical Conditions for Transferring Technology. We're going to kind of go through this process here by looking at what the agenda is. We've got the brief introduction of East West, which I'm going to explain who we are, why we're here. While we're covering this specific topic, we'll look at, briefly talk about the webinar series we're going to have through the end of December. We're going to then get into the introduction of the speakers. We got three very impressive speakers talking on this topic today. Then we'll move into the manufacturers relocating out of China and what are some of the critical considerations they have. And then part 5 is the Q&A discussion. And the Q&A discussion will take about 45 minutes. This is the majority of the conversation. The way East West conducts their webinars, like we have in the past, is it's really going to be a roundtable discussion, a conversation, if you will, between the speakers, answering a variety of different questions. We've already gotten 12, 13 questions we've identified for these speakers, and we will, I'm sure, be getting more. For those who are signing up, when you look at your control panel, you'll see an item that says questions. If you go in there and you type in a question, and you put it in there, then I'll be able to ask the speakers. If we have too many questions, we can't get them all done, we will follow with you with a verbal and with a written format afterwards. But otherwise, we're going to be asking all the questions today. So we get into a brief introduction of East West Associates. I'm going to briefly, East West, explain who we are, why we're here. We advise manufacturing companies on establishing and improving international manufacturing operations and global supply chains. We operate in China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Poland, Central Eastern Europe. We are not lawyers, we're not accountants. We provide kind of 4 core services. The first is global manufacturing and supply chain footprint. That's primarily for clients that are looking to relocate or evaluate their current manufacturing and supply chain footprint with a determination of how to get that closer to the customers, particularly companies that are trying to diversify from China and move into other areas to avoid tariffs or trying to get away from the high costs in China, or others are coming to us who are in China and they need to relocate within China because they're being moved out of current business parks. And so that would involve doing global site selection, working with companies, whether we're going into Vietnam, Thailand, Poland, Mexico, about getting government incentives. It's all around restructuring the manufacturing supply chain footprint. The second service is around operational, commercial, and performance. And right now, most of that work is for companies that have plants on the ground in China, and they're not sure how they're comparing up against their competitors, how they're stacking up against their competitors, and they've got they want to look and have someone come in and do a diagnostic of their business now, of the operational diagnostic, and then a review of the different functional areas of manufacturing, supply chain, procurement, determine how the company is and what can be improved. A lot of that's being driven by the lack of people involvement in COVID, of U.S. executives going to China, China's executives coming back. And then when the government started letting people in last year, it's been more of a trickle and not a flood. So they don't really know how they're ranking against their competitors, how they're doing in the marketplace. It also involves, we're doing a fair amount of corporate turnaround and restructurings for companies right now that are really having problems, particularly in China. Third area is around supply chain. It's everything related to supply chain, right? It's identifying suppliers, qualifying suppliers, setting up sourcing offices, supplier transition, and we're doing that globally, as well as the final area, which is human resources and risk management. And that's primarily, we do a lot of executive search work. And we've also noticed in the last 2 years, there's been last 2 to 3 years, there's been higher cases of fraud and corruption. And as a result of that, we're putting more of our interim general managers in factories or in companies where they have detected fraud and corruption, and they've had to fire some of the senior executives. And so we put in interim general managers, interim HR directors, and then we'll go find the permanent replacements. All right, so that's a little bit about East West. And we also finally, on the background checks, we've got ex-policemen, ex-military in these countries do background checks on new hires as well as new suppliers, right? We inevitably find new suppliers that the clients are bringing on, and then we'll find out the new suppliers may be owned by a family that owns several suppliers, and not getting the price transparency they're looking for. That's a little bit about East West. Here's where we operate. Again, U.S., Mexico, Eastern Europe, Poland, China, and Southeast Asia. And we're talking about Southeast Asia. We're talking about Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, etc. We have people on the ground, boots on the ground in all of these different regions. And then here's a brief sampling of our client base. On the webinar series, we'll be doing webinar series now until the end of December. We'll be doing approximately 9 webinars. We have 2 this week. This is on technology transfers today, and then closing manufacturing plants is on Thursday. And then beginning of October, we'll be coming out, rolling out our 4th quarter series on webinars, and you'll be certainly invited to attend those if you would like. Now, again, to the important stuff on the speakers, let me introduce the speakers today. We've got Dan McLeod, Director of East West Associates, Li Xiao, Director of China for East West Associates, and Zabong Lim, who's Senior Consultant for East West Associates. I will turn over to them to give a brief background on themselves. Dan, if you would start first.
Sure. Dan McLeod. Started my career in the U.S. As an engineer and had early assignments in process and production engineering, and went on to factory operations, ran facilities, and then the late 90s moved to China for a short-term assignment to oversee the building, design, and staffing and startup of a facility in Shanghai. That short-term assignment turned into 21 years in Asia. Majority of it in operating factories, developing supply chains, overseeing the design and build of larger investments in factories, and did that throughout Asia, in China, Indonesia, India, Taiwan, Korea, throughout the region. Started working with Alex in East West about 6 years ago, and since that time I've had an opportunity to work on similar types of projects around site selection, country selection, site selection, setting up new facilities, and been able to do that in China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, and Europe in that time. So yeah, that's been my background. Li Xiao?
Yes, thank you, Dan. Hello, everyone. My name is Li Xiao and based in Shanghai. Not like Dan, I was born and raised in China, so always in China. I have 20+ years experience working with multinational companies in Asia and in China, mostly doing business transformation and also turnaround projects. In the last few years, I've personally worked on many M&A projects, restructuring projects, of course, establishment in relevance to relocation, etc., and a few interim general manager projects, primarily for US and European private equity firms and also mid-sized multinationals. I also hold memberships in ATTA, which is called Asia Transformation and Turnaround Association, plus AmCham, American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. I always believe in continuous improvement, which is always a good thing to do in any type of a business. I'm very happy to take the opportunity to share some of my view and experience on technology transfer together with my East-West colleagues today. Yep. And Seben?
Sure, thanks. Good morning, everyone. This is Zabong Lim. I've held both technical and business management positions within Ashland, Hercules Incorporated, and Honeywell UOP. I've lived and worked in the US, Russia, China, Taiwan, Korea, India, and Indonesia. I'm currently based in Singapore, and I support projects throughout ASEAN and China. In my technical positions, I was the Chief Technical Advisor for refinery and petrochemical startups and technology transfer for UOP Honeywell, and also in charge of qualifications and management of Asian contract manufacturers and tolling companies for Ashland and Hercules. Thank you. Back to you, Alex.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you. So we've got 3 good speakers today. We are now going to turn to the idea of really why manufacturers are relocating out of China. What are some of the critical considerations that they're evaluating? Dan, I'm going to turn that over to you and let you start that if you would.
Sure. Just, looking back over the last 15, 20 years, certainly going back that far, so many international companies went to China really looking for an advantage on low cost and abundant labor. And over time, really starting 2007, 8, 9, you started to see double-digit annual increases in salaries and compensation. So started to become less attractive. Then next bubble, Alex. Yeah, and then certainly following increased labor cost, you started to see growing regulatory complexity. One of the advantages early on of going to China was it was from a regulatory standpoint, it was much more straightforward to get established and to operate, and that became more complex and became more of a administrative burden, and in some cases required additional capital costs for companies that wanted to stay there. Over time, started to see increased domestic competition. Many companies went there, they were rather unique in their field, or they had a very unique product offering. And then over time, much of that expertise was duplicated from domestic competitors, and it impacted pricing and took a lot of value out of the marketplace. So it required companies to get stronger. Then China 2025 was rolled out about 6 or 7 years ago. It was an effort to develop manufacturing base in China, higher value add, higher technology manufacturing base, and develop intellectual property. And as part of that, a push by the central government to buy from domestic companies, buy locally to prop them up. And so it's another blow towards international companies looking to operate in China. Then the tariff certainly years ago was a huge impact. This started, as you probably recall, this started with a year or so of let's see what's going to happen, but it looks like those tariffs have been locked in, at least for the foreseeable future, and companies have had to try to manage that and manage the shrinking margins in many cases for those companies that were shipping to a market in the US. COVID, of course, happened, and that not only disrupted supply chains, but we saw many organizations sort of struggle to maintain organizational alignment of goals and by their overseas operations, because you couldn't travel there, communication was more difficult. And now it's only been the last year or so that people have been able to travel back to China and have been faced with difficulties resulting from sort of lack of attention over a few years. And then finally, more recently, the slowing growth, the economic issues in China really started by the real estate sector, which has not been fully resolved yet, but very lower growth rates. The government is targeting 5%. Most outside analysts think that's a very optimistic view and will require some artificial, pumping money in the economy and infrastructure to achieve that. So becoming more and more difficult for companies to do business, and again, they're looking at expanding outside of China, whether relocating or expanding. Next slide, please, Alex.
Sure.
So if companies are looking outside of China, where are they looking? Well, we did a survey of 150 manufacturers operating in China a while back, and so which areas are you looking at further expansion or to reallocate capital? And by far, 74% of the respondents, when they were looking at Asia, primarily Southeast Asia, with a significant percentage also looking at Mexico and some into Central Europe. In Asia, what we've seen is a strong focus on Southeast Asia, but in the last year or so, India has gotten more attention and it has moved up. The American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai just published a report last year that indicated that India had moved up several spots in their analysis of alternatives to China. So that's been developing in the last couple of years. And again, also as companies look at to regionalize their supply chains after the difficulties they had in COVID, they want to get closer to their customers. And as I mentioned, you're seeing higher growth in markets outside of China, particularly Southeast Asia, where you're seeing generally greater than 5% growth rates in places like Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, which are an attractive basis. Next slide.
Yep.
Okay. So today we want to talk a little bit about technology and moving technology. And as I said, many companies are looking outside. Some hard data on that is that in just the last 4 years, over 100 MNCs have announced intentions to downsize or shut down manufacturing in China. So there is a little bit of data on the subject. And again, looking at the reasons of reduced labor and tariffs, as we mentioned. The challenge for many companies is China from a manufacturing perspective, a manufacturer base, supplier base, has a breadth and depth across industries that you just won't find anywhere else. And so the challenge is to find a country that's has the best fit for your particular manufacturing operation. And going through a site selection can be a bit complex. But many people, yeah, they will focus on cost of land, cost of labor, availability of labor. What sometimes gets overlooked and we want to highlight is the challenges associated with actually moving new technology from China, from one country to another, from China to outside. And there's a number of factors that can be regulatory, but just cultural, also cultural challenges that we want to talk a little bit about. And so that's what we hope to do. We hope to address today from people that have had the experience of moving facilities into China, moving facilities outside of China.
That's great. Thank you, Dan, for that conversation. Why don't we now take a look at, we're going to look at the individual questions that we've got as we get into the Q&A session. So now we have questions, 6 questions here. We've got another 7 on the next page, another 7 on the next page. And these are ones we've gotten. People have asked us to ask the speakers these kind of questions. So again, if you've signed in, please go ahead and go to the question section and type in your questions, and then they will forward those to me. But why don't we go ahead and get started on these kind of, and maybe initially the first question would be number 1, which is how do we define manufacturing technology? Maybe Dan, you start off with us on that question.
Yeah. I mean, where I'd like to start with that is really around manufacturing processes, the equipment that you're using, raw materials you're using, specifications, know-how that you've developed, designs that you've developed. It's not really talking about other IP such as patents, trademarks, or financial and commercial information that you may have developed over your years in China, but really looking at the know-how associated with how to produce a product. Again, materials, equipment, the procedures, and the quality assurance aspects of it also, which could be unique. And after many years in a location as far away from most headquarters as China is, that technology may have diverged from where it started 15 or 20 years ago. And again, that's where it leads to another question of, are you up to date with that? But generally, that's how we would describe the manufacturing technology.
Great. And Zebang, Li Xiao, would you all add anything to that? It kind of leads to the next question, which is on question 3. Li Xiao, starting off, talks about when you face the difficulty and limitations from the Chinese government about physically moving hard assets, including manufacturing machinery, out of China. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure, Alex. Previously, about 20 years ago, when China starts to open up, we actually import mostly machines from outside, and we experience similar type of issues. We wouldn't call it difficulties, but since like customs or tax authority, how to measure the value of the machine. Now, more and more questions or issues coming out when we try to relocate these machineries or hard assets outside China. We have to look at on two folds. The first one is, have we made certain communications with the Chinese authority, other than tax bureau and the commerce bureau, which is MOFCOM? Is our machinery or hard assets in the restricted category, or is it even in the banned category? We'll have to do some study over there. On the other hand, we should look at the receiving country. If it's in Southeast Asia or in Mexico, do these governments have certain regulations or policies limiting the hard assets to be transferred from China, especially second-hand machineries or pretty old machines? So we'll have to look at two folds.
And you find, are there certain industry sectors that are more restricted than others?
Yeah, because China almost every year will publish a catalog of certain industries to be protected or to be restricted, especially in biochemistry and semiconductor these days. It's a very sensitive industry. So if companies are belonging to those industries, we should take a closer look at these and make certain communications with the authority. And actually, to invite a third party to do that type of communication may help, and to avoid certain sensitivity in that regard.
And Vang and Dan, I think you all had comments on that as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add on it because the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, like what Li Xiao said, maintains a list of equipment that can or cannot be exported out of China. It would be wise to keep abreast of what is happening onto that list because it's regularly updated. To give you an example, the LiDAR technology and satellite technology is banned from being exported from China, and there are a huge category of items that are prohibited or restricted. For example, like even 3D printing technology is considered prohibited or restricted, and biotechnology, drug production technologies. So companies that want to move their manufacturing technology out of China would be wise to keep abreast of the list so that one does not run foul of the Chinese law. Okay?
And I guess just one other thing, as is typical for Chinese regulations, they tend to be written to be very broad and subject to interpretation. So in many cases, it would be very difficult to make your own determination based on the regulations. You really need to spend some time talking to the regulators to understand their intent fully.
That's right. That's right, Dan. Also, to add, and thanks for your guys' input. And also, I just thought about another thing. I wanted to remind everybody that if it's closing down China operation and then to relocate, this is especially sensitive to Chinese government. So we have to make sure that we clear all the tax liability plus the debt liability before we actually go approach the authorities to apply for the hard assets export. So that's kind of a different topic if we are actually considering shutting down the whole operation here in China.
Well, that's a good point, Luciao, because we've shut down 70 plus factories. And that's getting harder. That's getting tougher to do.
Right.
Dan, why don't let me ask you about once take number 2 when you're talking there about your technology and the product designs are adequately documented. Can you touch on that process and
Sure.
free to follow it?
Yeah, sure. It may, it may sound surprising, but we run into many cases where the headquarters really don't have a full understanding, fully up-to-date product design, raw material specifications, manufacturing know-how on the products that they are either producing or having a third party manufacture them for them in China. And it's understandable. It's you went there 20 years ago and you've developed enhancements probably to your manufacturing process, and maybe customized it for, in some cases, to the local market needs. But we often find that that information is not fully up to date, and make an assessment of that early on and understand the challenges of that may be required to get that sorted before you think about making a move, or can be significant. You want to understand what those are. I've seen it with a company that was making industrial components, large scale industrial components, both within their factory, and they also contracted to a third party. Really, that information was not held by the company much. It was held by a third party. So that became more and more difficult when you're looking at leaving, and that third party would lose their customer, their income stream. So not necessarily a not a smooth transition. Certainly, companies that are sourcing from China, very difficult for those. Oftentimes it's very difficult for them to have a complete specification on the product that if they're sourcing from a third party. We see that we've seen that where we've been requested to help a company find suppliers outside of China for key materials, and they really don't have enough of haven't defined their product well enough to be able to hand it off to a third party or a manufacturer in another region, Mexico in particular, to hand over and get it produced. So those are some of the challenges you see. You need to go through and identify that up front.
Yeah, that's correct, Dan. And usually after several years of manufacturing in a local country, what usually happens is the local production and process staff on site will make changes to the specifications of the equipment, the manufacturing process, and product specs without letting the global head office know. They don't do it out of malice, but they usually do it to meet the local specification requirements for their local customers and as required by the local sales staff. And if this is not properly documented, and when local key production or technical staff leaves, they will not be able to figure out why the changes were made in the first place and by who. One also needs to know if this relocation effort is a China +1 strategy or a zero China strategy. Zero China strategy meaning complete withdrawal from China. This has a big impact on how the project is to be run, who can help in the relocation efforts, as well as training for the staff in the target country. If it's a China +1 strategy, then things are easier to manage, as you can ask the host country technical staff to support training and development in the target country. Zero China strategy is harder to manage because the host country technical people know that they will be out of job when the project is completed.
Thank you, Zubeng, for that explanation on that. That's a good, very good point. Can you all talk, Dan, you talked about the example where the company did not have clarity on what was being produced in China. How did you manage that process when that's the situation?
Well, it slowed things down in that we had to really initiate an effort from the headquarter engineering group to become more involved and spend a significant amount of time auditing the design and several iterations of revisions to design back and forth. It really took 2 or 3 months to sort out before we could proceed effectively with the case it was going to Mexican manufacturers. It was mostly a slowdown, and it required unexpected, unanticipated engineering resources to sort it out, certainly.
Yeah. Okay. On that topic, kind of teeing into question here, number 6, Zubeng, could you talk a little bit about that, about localizing procurement of raw materials and components in your target country, and versus a reliance on your current suppliers in China?
Sure. In certain industries, even though that it may seem to be the same raw material based on specifications, there are subtle differences in the raw materials of pharma and food additive industry, which could impact the applications. Customers may require a change of raw materials to be notified of the change before it is implemented. I once moved a technology from India, did a technology transfer project from India to China. We could localize all the raw materials except for one. There is only one single source of this raw material, which was manufactured in India only and not available in China. There are similar raw materials, but not exactly the same available in China. So R&D China had to work doubly hard, but still a one-to-one replacement was not found after 2 years. So even after the successful transfer of technology from India to China, we had some customers in China, about 5% of them, who still insist on using the Indian-made materials, even though our application and R&D team could not find any discerning differences in the lab, but the customer reports a difference in their application. So for technology and raw materials that is being relocated, it will be wise for the project team to identify the key raw materials and supply small batches to the host country from the target country and make it into products for testing to ensure suitability. If the same production quality cannot be achieved by using the raw materials from the target country, the project manager and team needs to activate R&D to start looking into these localization efforts before they start to lose customers after successful relocation. Again, the China +1 strategy and Zero China strategy will make a difference on how one goes about this technology transfer project.
Dan, you and I think Li Xiao had a follow-up on that.
Yeah, I totally agree what Zubeng mentioned, especially in some very sensitive industries like aerospace and automotive or chemical industries. Raw material is very, very sensitive and needs to be compliant in many, many different aspects. So the company may need to look at different specs from EU, from US, from UL. Different auditor may look at different material source as well. Even if it's a simple stainless steel 304, the end user or the whole supply chain may audit and see what this 304 is coming from. Is it from certain industry? So even though they look similar, it may not pass the audit or it may not get approval from the end customer. So that's a very, very critical aspect to look at during the relocation stage.
Yeah. I guess the only other thing I was there are some sectors where, particularly around electronics, electronic components, heavily focused, heavily based in China, South China particularly, and to a large extent unrealistic to be able to find those type of materials outside of China in any significant quantity. So you may be tied to your, for certain materials, you may be tied to your China supplier base for some period of time until that changes. And again, that's to be aware of and be factored into the planning and decisions. It can be a long process to localize, and then in some materials you may have a difficulty, you may not ever get there, but it's one thing that needs to be prioritized in the planning up front.
Yeah, you know, there are certain industry sectors, you talk about chemicals, electronics, lighting, companies like that. Alicia, you were talking also about the idea of there may be different audit specifications.
Right. That's right.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, because if it's, let's say, aerospace or automotive industries, the whole supply chain will be very, very critical to the certain raw material, because the industry itself has very many compliance standards. A raw material could affect the whole supply chain. So when an auditor comes in, they will go on the country of origin and the source of raw material supplier to look at how this is being put into our supply chain. So before we do the relocation, before we start to really implement it, we need to do some internal audits, internal check to see, are we ready with this raw material? If it's in the new, receiving country, do we have certain pool of suppliers have been internally audited and pass our internal check? Otherwise, if we have put in mass production and it's getting sensitivity or getting failed actually by the auditor, then it will delay the whole schedule and then create many different difficulties.
No, that's a very good point, and yeah, it does create huge delays. Kind of teeing off the topic of localizing raw materials and components, it kind of opens up the idea for question number 7 here, which around really the manufacturing process allow you to meet the country of origin, right? And country of origin, where you're going, and then if you're going back to the U.S. market. So, Dan, why don't you take the first stab at that? I know we've got some, Alicia and Zhabang also have their comments on it, but why don't you first start off talking about the country of origin, if you would?
Sure. And this is much of this is driven by tariff avoidance, and so normally to be certified as a product of Thailand or Vietnam or Mexico, you need to demonstrate you meet a certain threshold of value add, and this could be locally sourced raw materials, it could be labor, utilities, factory overheads, in some cases marketing expenses and transfer pricing may come into the equation, and so you'd want to do an analysis of that early on to determine if you can make the country of origin requirement threshold, both in the country you're moving to, and then if you're shipping to the U.S. into the U.S. So it's really 2 determinations: one in the manufacturing country and one by U.S. customs authorities. These can become very deep. Deep analyses require significant expertise. We found that because a company has a good knowledge, if they've got a good knowledge of their processes and their current sourcing and potential supplier base, they can they can make an estimate. They can get directionally whether they're there, but we would recommend that people hire specialists to really to look deep into the product composition and determine whether you can meet that requirement. In Mexico, for example, I believe it's up to 70% local content now to qualify for treatment, duty-free treatment under USMCA. Yes, there we go. USMCA requirements. So, yeah. Yeah.
I think, Dan, though, on the country of origin, you talk a little bit about, I mean, when we work with our clients, I mean, what we're trying to do this at the very beginning. This is critical, right, of a go, no go. But can you talk a little bit about what makes up the requirements? In other words, what criteria is used to determine the country of origin requirements? For example, you can talk about, it can be everything from raw material, transfer pricing.
Normally starts with you take the bomb, fully exploded bomb with the material and the supplier where it's coming from. So you've got the country of origin of the various raw materials that you're using. Generally you can probably source some of those locally, and others are going to, at least during a startup phase, going to continue to be imported from your original suppliers, and add on the manufacturing costs. So it could be the labor costs, the utility costs. If you are running a factory, your factory cost, or it could be a tolling or contract manufacturing fee, which we paid to the local, local company. In Mexico, there are two different formats. One would include costs for marketing, logistics, and transfer pricing, profit. And another would be strictly related to product costs, and they're used for under different circumstances. But generally, it's around raw materials, labor, factory operating costs in the new site. Those are the big ones.
Yeah, and I guess the key thing is here we've noticed. Let's say you're relocating to Thailand, right? Then you got to meet the requirements of Thailand to make sure that Thailand views that as a Thai product and not a Chinese product if there are lots of components being sourced from China. And then you've got from Thailand back to the US, if it's being exported to the US, that they view it as a Thai product and not a Chinese product. And those two countries have their own different set of standards.
Yes.
Yes, and you normally are doing that when we're doing with our clients. We're normally doing the beginning, right?
Yes,
because that's really critical in the whole process.
That's right.
Okay. What kind of leads to if you've got about what kind of network you need to establish in these new locations, right? Dan's talked about country of origin. We've talked about questions that companies will face. I'll look at question number 12 here about which service providers, when you're going to a new location, do you need to establish, and which ones are most important? Obviously, you have a law firm and an accounting firm, right, and a firm like East West on the operational side. Li Xiao, could you talk a little bit about that? Which providers people ought to make sure they've got established in the new locations?
Yeah, definitely legal and compliance are the top priority, because that's the foundation of everything. And then tax and accounting are also very, very basic. I'm sure every company will find their close partner looking at these areas. Apart from these, I would like to address the other key elements. IT sometimes are kind of ignored or being put aside, and because usually IT is very, very integral part of the global arrangement. And if IT is not considered somehow, it can be creating trouble, and especially during the relocation, this type of a large projects. So we would recommend that companies look at IT as a critical part of this process. Another thing is on the maintenance, because there's a lot of hard assets, equipment to be moved from one country to another. We used to find some equipment when they have been relocated to a new location. Suddenly there's no agent or no dealers or no engineering firms to take care of the maintenance. Then it creates extra hustle for us, for the engineers to take care. So that could be another aspect to take an extra look at it. Another thing is the HR services. We're sure that the company will take care of, will spend time looking at the talent pool and workforce. But if you find really helpful headhunter or dispatch companies, it can actually be very effective, because if you don't really know about the turnover rate, if you don't really know about the attendance rate in the new market, it's definitely creates turbulences at the beginning. So if you have a trustworthy or a reliable HR firm to help you with that, that'll be very, very effective.
Yeah, I agree with that. And IT maintenance often overlooked on that. So Dan, when we're talking now about the different countries, let's look at question 11, which is about a manufacturing ecosystem in your country, because we see this quite a bit when we're helping companies relocate. Can you talk to question 11 and what it's addressing?
Yeah, it really, when you're looking where to locate, whether or not it's a country or more specifically a region within a target country, ideally you'd want a group of similar company, maybe certainly not direct competitors, but if your business requires a great deal of metal fabrication, for example, and assembly, then you'd look for companies in the region that do similar thing, preferably multinationals in the region, and that ensures that you've got some chance at a labor base that is familiar with the industry, familiar with the processes that you might be using. You've also reasonably sure that you can find supplier services and materials, and that you've got a government area that would appear to be reasonably supportive for that type of industry. If you've got long-term tenants in a similar industry, then you would assume the government would be familiar with them and be able to and be supportive of them. Again, one item that mentioned in the previous question about what services related to that would be establishing connections with other international manufacturers in where you're going, and using an organization like the American Chamber of Commerce that's located globally, multiple locations usually in each country, to get connected to the local government, local regulators, and some companies that have faced similar challenges you're going to be facing. So that's really what you're looking for. You don't want to be the first one in your type of industry, because the struggle there is going to be tremendous.
Yeah,
Agreed.
Zabang, I think you and Licia, you all had some comments on that.
Yeah, I think to add to what Dan just mentioned, the team that is in charge of the relocation needs to be very aware of which raw materials, which pieces of equipment are lacking in the target country, and make a backup plan for it. If not, it will be very hard for the relocation effort to be very successful. It is also very imperative that training be provided ahead of time by the host country staff to the target country staff in terms of maintenance, production process, and quality control for the relocation effort to go smoothly.
That's agreed. Alicia, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, on the ecosystem side, to keep the local industrial park or the local community contact, it will be very, very beneficial. So just to monitor the trend, how the government efficiencies look like, are they attracting more and more investments, or actually they are facing kind of a risk also, to keep lobbying the government to get in good contact with them, and then keep good relationship with them will be helpful.
Agreed, particularly in the countries where we're talking about, in China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, and Poland. That's at least.
Yep.
Let's turn our attention now, if we could, to more one around the human resources side of this on the relocation project, and also about the cultural side. And these are, I think first let's talk about question number 8 here. And Zbang, I'm going to have you talk about that, about how identifying and qualifying. You and Li Xiao and Dan have done a number of these relocation projects, and you've had them go well, and the ones that have not gone well, a lot of times have to do with personnel. So can you talk about how you're qualifying the right people when you're doing that relocation project?
Definitely, Alex. When I was tasked to move the manufacturing technology from India to China, I was the only person who had lived and worked in both countries and understands the different cultures and knows the technology. In my opinion, it is critical to put together a good team for the relocation effort. And the project leader for this endeavor needs to be someone who is not only technically competent, but also culturally aware and sensitive. He should be someone who has run large-scale projects and has a bird's eye view on everything and knows how to work with different people from different departments to get things moving. He or she needs to be culturally sensitive and curious and able to manage different and competing priorities, and there will be many. To give you an example, I was at a startup project in India, the largest grassroots refinery and petrochemical complex ever built back in 1999. We had to send 2 American startup staff back home because they were not culturally sensitive enough to the local Indian team, and it created a lot of misunderstanding and friction. The vice president of the local team actually requested them to be replaced. And another example was when I was in China, doing a startup and technology transfer for China Luoyang Petrochemical back in 2002. When I arrived on site, I realized that the local team was headed by American, and of course, the startup team was headed by American, and the local team, of course, is a Chinese counterpart. Yeah? There was a lot of friction and tension, which I don't really quite understand. And after arriving on site and listening into one of the meetings, I realized where the problem is. The problem was actually due to the translator. The American couldn't speak Chinese, and the Chinese counterpart, the refinery manager, could not speak English. So they go through everything through a translator, and the translator himself is not very good in English, actually. So he was doing a lot of translation that was actually wrong. So in the end, what happened was I took up the translator job other than my startup job. So in the end, I had to do everything in Chinese to make sure that the refinery manager knows exactly what we want for this technology transfer to be successful.
And Dan and Li Xiao, either one of you will add to that same point. You all have also had a number of these relocation projects.
Yeah, you know, when we tend to get focused a lot on equipment, processes, procedures on manufacturing a product. But the people, and so you tend to gravitate towards people that understand that, have a deep understanding of the technical know-how. And that's good, but those are not necessarily the best people to have on your team. You want people that are good communicators, are flexible, are engaging, that either have some experience or have an aptitude towards teaching and training and communicating. And those are skills that are often in conflict with a sort of typical engineering background person. You know, you don't find those people that have a mix of those sort of soft skills and technical skills as easily. So that's a challenge, but that's something that you should focus on going in. Find those kind of people to support the information transfer.
Well,
Totally agree.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with Dan and Seban on these points. Something that I feel also important would be the ownership and also accountability. Because in Asia, that some of our colleagues, they may not tend to raise questions. They feel it's okay, or when they feel it's not okay, they tend to just let it pass, because they don't have the full ownership, they don't have the full accountability. So that's why, or how to train these people, train our colleagues to be aware of this ownership and accountability will be critical at the very beginning.
That's a good point. Let's kind of use that to dovetail into question number 9 here. We're talking about here cultural differences. I mean, we've all had all three of you all have led relocations of China and Southeast Asia, Mexico, Poland, all throughout India, all throughout. And we're talking about cultural differences, and this is not simply, you know, getting the food right and that kind of stuff, but the cultural differences we're talking about here, ones that affect the success of the project, right? That are serious enough, they affect the success of the project, or they delay a project, and thus they affect the budget. The budget's overrun. So these are kind of real cultural differences, and there are a lot of them. And a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate between China and Southeast Asia the cultural differences. They're certainly seeing that with China and Mexico. But I will start off here on number 9. Dan, why don't you start off, and then Zebang and Lisha, I know you all have comments as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's there. Yeah, an appreciation for the cultural differences around the, there are certain basic sensitivities around culture. It could be around language, it could be around religion, or, food, as you mentioned. These things can be challenges for people that are relocating to a new country for a startup, certainly. But more fundamentally is the way, the way people learn. Do you have a group that's more hands-on oriented, more verbal, more communicative, or those versus a culture that tends to be more technical, straightforward? I think Li Xiao mentioned a comment around being sort of a deferential and a willingness to say no or ask questions. Need to be cognizant of that. I mean, certainly I've seen those types of issues in the Philippines, Mexico, Indonesia, where the culture is one that generally doesn't challenge authority, and so you need to actively work towards bringing people out to manage that. Those are some of the primary ones that I can think of come to mind. And I know, Li Xiao and Zebang, you've had situations where you've seen stark contrast in expectations around responsiveness and timing and work hours and all those sorts of things. Maybe you can share a couple of those.
Yeah, sure. I think like the management saying goes, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So between the host country and the target country, you need to understand the differences in culture in terms of individualism versus collectivism, the difference to authority. I have worked in India for technology transfer, and also I've worked in Korea for technology transfer. These two cultures are way totally different. For example, in Korea, they plan the startup in 15-minute intervals. In India, they get to it when they get to it. So these are very different way of doing things, and it can be very frustrating if you do not understand the differences in the culture. especially if you come from a fast-paced culture like the American culture or Singapore culture, and then you're placed in a startup in India. Things can drag on pretty long. And then to give another example, there was in Singapore, we have a Singapore government supported strategy to locate manufacturing in Batam Island, Indonesia, which is like 45 minutes away by ferry from Singapore, to take advantage of the lower cost of manufacturing. A few years ago, a big group of Indonesian workers barricaded the Singapore manager's office in the office on Batam Island for several days to demand higher pay. On top of this, not just about culture, also there are things we need to think about in terms of geopolitical tensions. We need to think about tensions between China and Vietnam, Philippines over claims on the South China Sea. This may make things difficult for the host country team to smoothly transition the technology and manufacturing know-how to the target country if they are like Vietnam or Philippines. Over to you, Lisha.
Yeah, since we're talking about relocation, I guess no matter if it's a hosting country or the receiving country, because they may have some mental effects that, especially for the receiving country, we are taking it over. But to the management team, that it may be important that to tone down a little bit on that, to train everybody that to say this is a one team project instead of we're transferring this from here to there, and we're losing this in this country and we're gaining this in the other country. We try to minimize that, and then we say this is a global effort. This is one team effort to minimize the cultural differencing and then minimize the cultural shock. That may be helpful.
That's a very good point, Michelle. Look, I know it's 12:02, so a little past 12 o'clock deadline. For all those who need to hop off, that is fine. We have an hour hard stop. We do have these questions that were sent to us, so I want to make sure we answer them. We have two more questions to answer, and I think we want to answer them for the clients, but if people have to leave, that's certainly understandable. But if I'd ask the speakers just to stay on to answer the questions from the registrants for two more of them. Number 10, this really deals with trade compliance and certifications. And it's all about minimizing the tariffs and the duties. And this is a pretty key topic that keeps coming up on our different projects, whether it's from China to Latin America, China to Mexico, China to Southeast Asia. So Dan, can you take the number 10 and address that first?
Yeah, sure. Probably the most significant one we run into is in Mexico, which has got well-developed programs to assist companies that are manufacturing in Mexico and exporting in the U.S. You know, the major ones would be the IMEX program, which goes back in one form or another many years, maquiladora factories. And that allows companies that are manufacturing in Mexico for export to import raw materials duty-free and use them and then export them again. It's for companies that have a very low Mexico domestic market presence. You can sell a few percent of your output into Mexico, but it's really focused on selling in the US. And once you achieve that, you become certified with that. That allows you to, again, import materials duty-free and avoid paying VAT and avoid paying it. And in some cases, if you export, you can petition the government for a refund on your VAT, but it will take you months and months, if not years, to get it. So this sort of streamlines and avoid paying it altogether. Another program in Mexico that's important is the PROSEC, the promoted sectors. So if you're in the electronics, the automotive, the aerospace industries, or there's several, it would allow you to import raw materials duty-free to produce into those sectors, regardless of where your product's going to. So you can you can get duty relief if you're selling domestically in Mexico as well as exporting to the U.S. And the third big one that doesn't get thought of so much as facilitating trade, but it's actually very important, particularly in Mexico, is CTPAT, which is it's a certification around security of your supply chain, your transit systems. It was basically developed as a post 9/11 anti-terror security to make sure that goods weren't coming into the U.S. that were suspect or could be used for terrorism activities. And once you become certified, once you demonstrate that you've got adequate controls of your inventories and your product, and you get secure shipping practices, and once you're certified, that streamlines your border crossings. It so allows you to get through both import and export of materials much quicker, particularly the export if you're going to the U.S. So you get more reliable delivery times. You're less likely to get held up at the border, and so it's pretty significant. And basically you have to certify to the U.S. government that you've got good controls in place on your inventory and your security. So those are the big ones that we see most.
That's excellent. Thank you. And I know we have one other question that I want to get to. Someone sent in a question around number 4. And Zabang, I wanted to ask you the question, access to transfer tooling from your current supplier, because that's become an issue, right? People are relocating and trying to get equipment. Can you address question number 4 for the registrants, please?
Sure. I think about 12 years ago, I had to transfer technology from Europe to India, and because of that, I had to localize all the raw materials in order to achieve a low-cost product to compete in the Indian market. Then 3 years back, I was asked to transfer the same Indian technology to China because the Chinese customers were getting the products from India, and the Indian plant was already maxed out in capacity. The main issue is that the critical equipment that is required, the supplier does not have a representative office in China, and hence will not be able to support it for maintenance after the startup is completed. So we had to find an alternate equipment supplier in China, and that set our project back about 2 to 3 months because we had to test different equipment using half-finished products shipped from India to China to make sure that the final product can meet our specs using the equipment in China. So a lot of testing was done by Chinese R&D and my Chinese engineer on the side of the Chinese equipment manufacturer. And after about 2 months, we finally able to find a suitable supplier for this piece of critical equipment. So when transferring technology out of China, one needs to determine if the maintenance of the critical equipment in the target country could be an issue, and also the availability of spare parts. The maintenance team also needs to be properly trained in the target country so that equipment can be run smoothly.
Yeah. And it's not unusual for a manufacturer to get into a relationship with a supplier that they've paid for specialized tooling, and that could be in metalworking, injection molding, extrusion. Similar types of processes. The challenge is if you are leaving and trying to get that tooling or equipment from your supplier that you think you have an agreement with, more often than not, you're not going to get that tooling and equipment from the supplier. The legal options for getting that are limited, and it's been our experience that many companies end up having to, replace their tooling or any specialized equipment, and they essentially write off their investment in those that they've left with suppliers in China. So that becomes very difficult.
Yeah, that is a very good point. All right, I know we're about 10 minutes over, but we wanted to get to all the questions. So I think of all the people, we appreciate everyone attending. I think we will be having, you will always send a webinar survey. We hope you answer it and fill it out, and we'd love the feedback. I'd like to thank Dan McLeod and Zabong and Lim and Lee Shao for coming on and providing their expertise for an hour and answering all these questions, particularly staying over and answering the questions. And that concludes today's webinar. Thank you very much, and we will look forward to having you on the next East-West webinar, which is Thursday, about closing manufacturing plants in China. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.